thank you very much for having me here today. I was going to talk a bit about what it's like to be an MP, to be a shadow minister, and to help give a bit of an insight, I think, into Parliament. I wasn't going to say too much politically about the forthcoming election and so on, but I'm happy to answer questions on some of those issues. I'm sure Andy's getting ready to lobby me and the Labour Party about tuition fees, which we can have a row about another time, and those issues as they're facing the universities, who, in my view, have got a very good deal out of the whole funding arrangement at the moment, but let's have that argument another day. So I'm here to talk about what it's like to be a shadow minister and to be in the Houses of Parliament. I mean, I actually think every different person could give you a different perspective on what it's like to be an MP or to be a shadow minister. I don't know if any of you have watched the Inside the Commons documentary that's been on. I mean, I've learnt loads watching that. So just, that I always think that that's the sort of perspective, is that there were things happen, places I've never seen or heard of, or processes I didn't understand until I watched that programme myself. So we all come at this with our own sort of perspective, because the first thing I'll say is there's no job description for an MP. There's no job description really for a shadow minister, or there's a bit more of a job description for an actual minister. There's no training. There's no induction, there's no all the kind of usual things that you get either as a student or as an employee. So you really do shape the job yourself in terms of what your priorities are and how you think you can be most effective and make the most impact. So I'm just going to reflect a bit on what I think, how you make that job work. And then I always think that these things work better with questions and answers as well. So think of it less of a lecture. I don't really do that's what you do at universities. We don't do lectures, we do talks, or we have debates or whatever. But anyway, we'll give it a go. So I thought it was just first of all worth reflecting a bit on the context of where we are today in relation to what a politician is, what a modern politician is. I mean, you mentioned there Tony Lloyd, my predecessor, in the introduction. When Tony was elected, he was elected in when was he elected now? No, when was he elected as an MP?
83, I think?
Yeah, he was nearly 20, because he was 29, yeah. So 1983 he was probably elected, first of all. And even in the 80s, let alone sort of before that, politicians were largely held in quite high esteem by the public. There was a sort of certain amount of deference towards MPs. MPs in general terms, not Tony, but often in sort of general terms were, Tony kind of was, I suppose, middle-aged, middle-class sort of blokes who lived in London and occasionally would visit their constituencies from time to time, but they were very much focused on the kind of national parliament side of their jobs. And today, the expectations placed on a politician, the way that we are viewed by the public, has changed overwhelmingly, really, and changed vastly. And I think 30 years ago, when Tony was first elected, I think he probably had the resources to maybe have one secretary working for him, possibly in Manchester, and an assistant in London. But the demands placed on our constituency offices and so on today are very different. So today, an MP, the phone in my office here in Manchester, for example, I think about 4 or 5 staff work for me here in Manchester. My phone rings the entire day, all day. If I had 2 phone lines, they would both be going all day, every day. I've got 100,000 electors on the register here in Manchester Central, and it's one of the most deprived communities. And people come to me as often their first and often their last port of call in terms of getting advice and services that they need. So the expectation on us kind of locally is greatly different. And rightly, in my view, we're also expected to be seen and be more visible in our communities and our constituencies. People expect to see you where they live and where they're at and out and about at their residence meetings and so on and so forth. So there's a great deal of bigger demands these days on an MP in relation to their constituency work than just their parliamentary work. And I think that's a good thing, because I think the relationship, therefore, between how policies and politics kind of impacts on the ground is a tighter relationship. So you see firsthand the problems with, welfare changes, for example, some of the more recent things. So the introduction of the bedroom tax or the sanctions regimes or whatever, you see firsthand, often more quickly than policymakers in London see, the impact that these are having to real people's lives, and that relationship is important. But I think there's also a great deal of cynicism these days about politicians, and I think this is something that's come about over time, and actually something we're going to have to address, otherwise we're going to find ourselves in quite a difficult sort of democratic situation as voter apathy grows larger and voter turnout gets lower and lower. And I think this political crisis has come about over a long period of time. It started really maybe in the 80s under Thatcher, a sense that Thatcher didn't really support all of Britain, and it kind of created more division. We then had John Major's sort of back to basics, and then that kind of came and stung him in the tail, because the sort of politicians didn't live their own lives in the way that they were lecturing others. Through Tony Blair's government as well, even though there was a great deal of optimism and excitement about him coming into government, by the time he sort of left government post-Iraq war, and huge kind of public opposition to a big decision that he took led to a further diminishing in public support for government. And then after that, the expenses scandal, which really was the icing on the cake for what people thought was everything that was wrong about sort of politics today and politicians, that we were all in it for ourselves. And obviously I wasn't an MP at the time, but there clearly were MPs at the time who were doing things they shouldn't have been doing. Some were engaged in criminal activity and have gone to prison for it. But many others, I think, kind of lost the perspective between what was publicly acceptable and what they privately were up to. So that I think over time has generated a deep sense of cynicism and anger, and now we have a growing population who are at best probably disinterested in politics and keep themselves away from politics, or at worst kind of deeply kind of angry and cynical about our sort of political system. So I think that's the sort of context under which I'm trying to do a job. And for me, and I think the vast majority of MPs in Parliament, we aren't in Parliament to kind of further our own financial situation or anything like that. We are, from all parties, genuinely trying to make changes that we believe will be to the benefit of our communities. And I think that's quite a hard message to get across in that climate today. One of the other contexts I just want to sort of talk about before talking about some of the specifics about the role is for women in politics. I'm still in the minority as a woman MP. I think a statistic that always horrifies me is that there are more male MPs in the House of Commons today than there have ever been women MPs, ever. Which I always think gives you a kind of pause for thought about how few women there still are. So in the Labour Party, I think we've now got about 44% of the Parliamentary Labour Party are women MPs, which is much better record than the other two main parties, which is why overall Parliament is still less than a quarter women MPs. So this is just something that's not right. We could often, when I do these kind of events, people ask me about all women shortlists, because they have been a controversial thing that the Labour Party's brought in, and people say, isn't it better to get where you get on merit? I've absolutely got to where I've got to on merit, but unless we have some ability for positive discrimination, we are never going to get in the kind of time frame that we need to get it, the kind of representation in Parliament that we need. So if we carried on without all women shortlists, I think it would have been 150 years or more before we'd got anything like nearly 50% of women in Parliament. And we're still some way short of that, but we are advancing. And I'm also a mum as well. I've got 3 kids under 10. Well, 1 stepson and 2 that I've given birth to, and that as well is still unusual in politics. And I think part of that is about the impact that it has on your actual life. So, you know, my kids are at school in Manchester. The littlest one I take down with me to London every week. There's now a nursery in the House of Commons, which is a great innovation that came about 3 years ago. But yeah, I think for any mum, for me and for any mum, to leave your children for 3 or 4 nights a week with your husband, however good a husband they are, not always that great at washing teeth and doing hair and everything else, but you know, however good your husband is, you know, that is a really hard decision, I think, for any mum, and that is, we've got to accept that is still one of the big barriers as to why fewer women. I'm not saying it's not a decision for a dad, but I think it's on the whole, it is a slightly easier decision for a dad to do. And I think the second barrier that we still face for women in politics today is that environment of cynicism and difficulty, because I think your kids, people at school are like, oh, your mum's an MP, and you know it's not very nice, but also the kind of public eye that it puts everyone in. The example I always give is, you know, it's really hard to be normal some of the time when you're an MP. I couldn't really shout at my kids in the supermarket, for example, although I probably do a bit more than I should. But all it takes these days is for someone to take a little video of that, whack it on Facebook or Twitter or something, and and if you just happen to catch the wrong moment of that telling off, it might look like you were a really awful mum. Or any other examples like that, what my husband gets up to at work, what's happened to my kids at school, if my kids get into trouble and so on. I think women are maybe more aware than men about the pressures that puts on your personal life, and it makes them reluctant to want to do that, because it's very rare in politics these days you get any thanks for anything you do. It's a pretty sort of relentless diatribe most of the time, especially on social media, about how what a horrible person you are. So you have to think about those things. I'll just touch on, in terms of women in politics, you'll have all seen our pink bus this week that we went out on the road. Now, the reason we've done that, not the pink, but we can go into the pink if you want to in questions, but the reason that we still feel that in 2015, in the general election campaign, there's a real need to have an engagement and a campaign that specifically is targeting women, is that women are still less likely to vote as well. I think Harriet's figures that she's got is that there was over 9 million women at the last election who didn't vote, and that's many more than their male counterparts. So there's lots of reasons why we still need more women in Parliament, but I just wanted to give you that sort of reflection, really. And most of my funny anecdotes from being an MP and a shadow minister relate to being embarrassing situations with my children, but I won't go into those now. We can have that conversation another time as well. So, I mean, I think just to build on what I was saying before about being an MP, that is still a key part of being a shadow minister as well. I don't think you can differentiate the two. You have certain roles and responsibilities as a shadow minister, but they interrelate with your role as an MP as well. One of the challenges I face here in Manchester Central, which is why I was like coming to the university as well, is that, for those who don't know, I hold the dubious title of the MP that's been elected with the lowest ever turnout in a parliamentary election, because my by-election, because it fell on the same day as the Police and Crime Commissioner elections, where turnout was very low, that obviously also translated into my parliamentary by-election, and I was elected on a turnout, I think it was 18.4 or 5% of the vote. And in any case, in Manchester Central, in the general election in 2010, it was the lowest turnout too. It was I think it was 49% there. And that's because this constituency does have a high number of young people. That's the main reason. If you look demographically, if you look at the March register from all the elections, turnout in the areas where students live and where young people live are much, much lower turnout. So one of the things that I try to bring to my job in general is how can we re-engage with young people in order to vote. So, for example, I've been pushing very hard for votes at 16 to go into the Labour Party manifesto, and that's why I'm always delighted to come and do things, on campus as well. And when I would have lots of meetings with young people to try and kind of engage them, and I ask them, what does a politician look like? Do I look like a politician? I mean, one person once said to me, no, you look like a model. So I was like, all right, that's fine. I don't. But anyway, but they always say, a middle-aged kind of white bloke. And, that is why we have to change that as well. And for me, a critical issue in terms of that job as an MP is that I'm local. It does matter to me, and I think it is an important thing in politics today that I am like my constituents, because I'm a Mancunian. I live in Manchester. I grew up in Manchester, and I have many of the same experiences as many of my constituents. Although, albeit that of course I'm an MP, and therefore I earn more money than most of my constituents, and I have a weird life because I sort of troop up and down to London and I'm an MP. But apart from that, I'm not dissimilar. So I think all those things matter in terms of being an MP, but also being a shadow minister as well. So I was just going to say something about that now, because that's what the lecture's about. So being a shadow minister. So I was first appointed. I've only been an MP for 2.5 years. I was pretty kind of gobsmacked when just a year into being an MP, I was asked by Ed Miliband to be the shadow childcare minister, which I was delighted to do. I've been doing a lot of campaigning on getting more affordable childcare into the system. And then it was probably about a year after that, so 4 months ago, Ed Miliband asked me to join the shadow cabinet, to be the shadow Secretary of State for the Cabinet Office, and to also help Douglas Alexander in coordinating Labour's general election campaign. So I did get there was a bit of kind of negative reaction amongst some of my colleagues about that, because I've only been an MP for 5 minutes, and there is a sort of sense in Parliament that you really ought to kind of do your time before you get these jobs. But I mean, somebody asks you to do a job, you've got to get on and do it. So that's what I have been doing. So it's a real privilege to get to do these extra jobs in Parliament. And then I think kind of what makes an effective shadow minister, as I said at the beginning, different people would give you a completely different answer depending on who they were. But for me, it's not about a lot of those things, and they'll help me to say this because it's the Houses of Parliament who are sponsoring this event, but it's not a lot of those things that you see on the inside the Commons and what you might see on the telly in terms of the work that you do in the dispatch box and getting the urgent questions or getting the debates. Although that's part of it, I think using Parliament is only a small part of actually making impact as a shadow minister. So for me, I think you have to be very clear about what is your agenda, what is the 1 or 2 things that you're trying to deliver as a shadow minister. So when I was the childcare spokesperson, I wanted to make sure that the Labour Party policy going into the election was a very strong offer on childcare, and I'm pleased that we have got good policies on that in relation to extension of free childcare and wraparound care and everything else. I was campaigning for those issues. So how do you actually make an impact? Part of it is policy. Part of it is policy making. Part of it is building alliances with external stakeholders as well. Part of it is making sure that you are getting attention for what you're espousing. So that does include Parliament and having debates and tabling parliamentary questions in Parliament and so on. But it's also using the media, whether that be social media or traditional media, to try and push forward your agenda as well. And then another aspect to the job of being a shadow minister, which is the more traditional job, I suppose, which is being an effective opposition, so holding the government to account. So there are two different sort of sides to the job. One is hold the government to account, expose them for what they're doing when you feel it's wrong, or give them credit when you think it's right. And the other is to try and push the agenda forward, both within your own party, but within the public as well. And sometimes those things work together and sometimes they don't. So an example I would give in terms of when I was the shadow childcare minister was I tabled some parliamentary questions in relation to dads and whether dads felt they were able to get the kind of time off to spend with their children and how that was working and so on. I got some really interesting figures back from those parliamentary questions that dads were half as likely as mums to ask for flexible leave requests from work, and then they were half as likely again to get those leave requests delivered, acted upon. And I felt this was quite a sort of, it shone a light really on the agenda, the cultural differences that there are for dads versus mums in the workplace. So I started working with a number of external bodies, Working Families, which is an organisation which champions the cause of sort of working parents, the IPPR, which are a think tank, and they were doing a big piece of work around family life and childcare. And all of this kind of led to a big piece of work that the IPPR were doing. I mean, they were doing it independently, but you know, I was kind of feeding them and giving them some of the information that I was getting as well, and working with Working Families and others to some major pieces of work coming out that were suggesting that dads should actually you know, get more paternity leave, that would be a good thing in the system. And then so I launched my figures that I'd got on the parliamentary questions ahead of Father's Day, which meant that we got some really good media coverage for it. We did a whole weekend of kind of broadcast, and the IPPR were launching their report around the same time, calling on this Daddy Leave Month policy to be adopted. And I was pleased to then, in my new role as part of the sort of general election coordinator, to then make sure that as part of that policy, we were actually able to formally announce that Labour would adopt that policy just on the Monday just gone. I don't know if you saw that. So part of getting that through that whole cycle is building up the alliances, building up the evidence, using Parliament as one of the platforms by which you can advance those campaigns and causes. But then you've also got to have the relationships within your party to actually build an alliance for such a policy. So I think hopefully that gives you one example. Of course, you have to, as I say, take your party with you as well. So part of the job of being a shadow minister is to engage with your colleagues as well. So you've got to make sure that you spend time either on a one-to-one basis or in small groups, or at the meetings like the Parliamentary Labour Party meeting that happens every Monday, updating colleagues or talking to colleagues or getting their opinion and advice on what you're doing as well, because you can have brilliant ideas, brilliant policies, you can have good evidence and you can get stuff through Parliament, but if you're isolated within your party and you haven't really got those alliances, then it's very tough to actually sort of make the impact that you want. I'll just say a little bit about taking on the opposition as well. So I think maybe earlier on in the cycle, the parliamentary cycle, so maybe the couple of years straight after a general election, your focus is much more on taking on the government and exposing them for what they're doing. And then as you get nearer and nearer a general election, that the balance of that sort of switches more to your own party policy development and then into the general election campaign itself. So I guess in my time, I've done less of the taking on the government and exposing the government than I have sort of developing our own kind of agenda and party policy. But of course, you know, that is where Parliament is absolutely at its best in terms of holding the executive to account. You can do that very effectively as an opposition spokesperson or an opposition minister. So, and we've seen real advances under John Bercow. I don't know how many of you are sort of students of the parliamentary system, but we've seen real advances under John Bercow as Speaker in holding the executive to account. So I'll give you a few examples. He's brought in these devices called urgent questions, which I think have been around for donkey's years, but under previous speakers weren't ever really permitted. So every morning, depending on what's happening in the day's news or any reports coming out, any MP can put in for an urgent question, which is a bit like getting the same airtime as a formal parliamentary statement, but you usually as an opposition MP is asking for an urgent question. So let's think about this week. I think my colleague Shabana Mahmood, who's a spokesperson in the Treasury team, asked for an urgent question on the HSBC scandal, because the government weren't coming forward to make their own statement on that, which they should have been doing. So my colleague, who's a shadow minister in the Treasury team, asked the Speaker, could she have an urgent question granted on the HSBC scandal, which he granted, and he's been brilliant. John Bercow has been brilliant at granting urgent questions. I think there are at least, I don't know what the statistics are, but I'd say there's probably 3 or 4 of those a week these days. And I think under previous speakers, there weren't any urgent questions. So the minister is then called to Parliament and they have to answer questions on said subject. And that's been a fantastic tool at holding the government to account. Also, what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years, which I think has been another great innovation, is the strengthening of the select committee system as well. And that can be a great tool, especially as a backbencher, for holding the government to account as well. So the select committee system, probably some of you know this better than me, to be honest, but the select committee system used to be very much at the say-so of the whips. So who got appointed on which select committee, who was the chair of which select committee and so on, used to be at the say-so of the whip. So what happened was the chairs of select committee tended to be people who would cooperate with the government of the day or the whips on the opposition party. But now they're elected. Again, I think John Bercow brought this innovation in, yeah. So now they're elected of colleagues. So actually what we're seeing are much more robust scrutineers and people who are prepared to take on their own government if they're a Tory backbencher or otherwise. So you've seen through that, I think Margaret Hodge has been a fantastic example of somebody who's come in with a real agenda as the chair of a select committee. She's the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, which is a very powerful one. But before she had that job, I couldn't tell you who'd been the chair of her committee. So she's doggedly pursued issues around tax avoidance, for example, and the role of the Treasury and HMRC in that. She's also exposed government inefficiencies and failure on spending and so on. So there's been a real strengthening of that arm as well. And as backbenchers generally, also the other thing that John Bercow has changed is that he is the way in which he calls questions and calls people in the chamber. So they used to be, before I was an MP, they used to be very hierarchical. So if there's a statement of the day or a UQ or there's a debate happening, you have to sit in Parliament and stand up every time somebody sits down and see if you can get called. It's like a ridiculous sort of system, which when I was pregnant I just couldn't do. That's another story. And then it used to be done in seniority. So if you were a previous Secretary of State or something like that, you get called first all the time. John Bercow is brilliant. He doesn't have, it's just a a flat, non-hierarchical system, and anybody gets called. So it's enabled people like Sarah Champion, who got elected at the same time as me, the MP for Rotherham. It's enabled her to really use Parliament as a fantastic platform to expose some of the child abuse issues that are happening in Rotherham, because she's been able to ask questions in Parliament in a way that 10 years ago she would never have got called. She would have had to have done her time for 5 years. So she's been able to come in quickly as an MP and sort of make an impact using Parliament to do that. So they are the more sort of traditional ways of using Parliament to do that. But I suppose what I was trying to say at the beginning is that you also have to be able to use the media and social media and stakeholders and other groups to really support the work that you're doing in Parliament. So just before we move on to questions, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but anyway, I'm droning on. I'll just say a little word about the general election. So as the coordinator of the general election for the Labour Party, that's a very different role. It's a very unique role that really doesn't have much to do with Parliament at all, but it is the role that now we are all moving towards the general election. Increasingly, shadow ministers as well as ministers are thinking about campaigning and thinking about being out about in the country, in key seats, in their own constituencies and everything else. So at this stage in the cycle, Parliament is becoming less relevant, and in fact Parliament's going to dissolve in about 3 weeks, I think. So we're going to have the longest ever general election sort of campaign. So I hope that doesn't put you off that too much. So really my job with that is outside of all the traditional job descriptions of a shadow minister. I'm in the Labour Party HQ, where I'm now based full-time when I'm in London, and I'm driving forward Labour's general election campaign, whether that's about what we're doing on the field or what we're doing in the media and with their sort of what you would call the air war. So I'm happy to take questions on that as well if you want, but that was just a snip. So that's some insight, I hope. Thank you.
Can I